"Get out of this lounge. We don't serve your kind in here. Take your bags and go back to whatever motel you came from." The man didn't move. He sat with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold while the argument above him got louder. He looked like a professor on a sabbatical, maybe a civil engineer passing through on a contract job, the kind of man you'd walk past in an airport terminal without registering his face. That was exactly what he'd counted on. Something slipped from his coat when the manager grabbed his arm. A lanyard, a badge, a photograph. The front desk clerk saw it before anyone else did. Her hand went to her mouth. The reservation binder she'd been holding hit the marble floor, pages fanning out across the tiles like a deck of cards. Then the manager looked down. What happened in the next 48 hours cost him his career, his license, and the reputation of every person who had stood in that lobby and said nothing. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand where this story begins. Not in the lobby of the Lakemont Grand Hotel. In a town called Creighton Falls, Ontario, population 6,000 and change, 3 hours north of Toronto on a highway that most people only drive if they have a reason. Creighton Falls had a main street with a pharmacy, a hardware store, a Legion Hall, and a hotel that had been the nicest building in town since 1987. The Lakemont Grand wasn't grand by any city standard. It was 4 stories of pale brick and green awnings, a revolving door that stuck in winter, a restaurant on the ground floor that served the same Caesar salad it had been serving since the Mulroney years. But in Creighton Falls it was the place: wedding receptions, retirement dinners, the occasional visiting politician who needed somewhere to sleep before a photo op at the mill. The hotel had been purchased 3 years earlier by a Toronto hospitality group. New ownership, new branding, new management brought in from outside. His name was Aldric Fennimore, 41 years old, imported from a mid-tier business hotel in Mississauga, eager to prove he could run something with a bit of prestige. He had a firm handshake and a way of standing in the lobby that suggested he believed the building belonged to him personally. The town was roughly 70% white. The remaining 30% were Ojibwe and Métis families, who had been in the region since before the town had a name, along with a smaller community of Caribbean and West African families who had come up in the 70s and 80s for the mining work. If you looked at who ate in the Lakemont restaurant on a Friday night, who booked the conference rooms, who Fennimore greeted by name when they walked through the revolving door, the picture narrowed considerably. There had been 2 complaints filed with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal in the past 14 months, both from black guests, both describing the same pattern. Asked for identification at check-in when white guests beside them were not. Followed through the lobby by staff. Told their reservation couldn't be located despite confirmation numbers in hand. Both complaints were still pending. Nobody in Creighton Falls knew that those complaints had been assigned to a specific investigator. Owen Dakers pulled into the parking lot of the Lakemont Grand on a Thursday afternoon in late October in a rented Nissan Sentra, with the heat already running and the wipers going against a slow sleet. He stepped out and stood for a moment in the cold hands in the pockets of a dark wool coat that had seen better winters. 61 years old, broad shoulders that had softened slightly with age. Reading glasses folded in his breast pocket. He looked like a retired school principal visiting a grandchild. Like a man who drove carefully and tipped well and went to bed at 10. What the parking lot could not tell you was that Owen Dakers spent 23 years with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Before that, 4 years as a Crown prosecutor in Hamilton. Before that, Osgoode Hall Law School, second in his class. He had reviewed the case files of over 300 human rights complaints across the province. He had testified before legislative committees. He had sat across tables from hotel directors, store managers, and regional VPs who thought their position made them untouchable. His face had never once given any of that away. He checked his phone before going in. A message from his daughter, Simone. "Be warm, Dad. Love you." He sent back a thumbs up and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. Around his neck, tucked beneath his scarf, a lanyard. An Ontario Human Rights Commission identification card. His photograph, his name, his title, Senior Field Investigator. He left the scarf on. He wasn't planning to be here long. 1 night, maybe 2, observation only. Just a hotel in a small town on a list of small towns. He pushed through the revolving door. The lobby smelled like pine cleaner and something floral that was probably pumped through the vents. Dark wood paneling, a fireplace with a gas flame, a chandelier that was doing its best. Behind the front desk, 2 clerks. One of them, young woman, maybe 24, name tag reading Joelle, looked up when Owen came through the door and offered a genuine smile. The other, a man about the same age, was already looking somewhere past Owen's shoulder. Owen walked to the desk. He'd made a reservation online 3 days prior. Standard room, 2 nights, his real name. Good afternoon. He slid his credit card and his personal identification across the counter. Reservation under Dakers, Owen Dakers. Joelle started typing. Dakers, D-A-C-R-E-S. Just a moment, sir. She found it in 12 seconds. He watched her face. Nothing unusual there, just the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. There we go, Mr. Dakers. 2 nights, standard king. Checking out Saturday morning. She printed the key cards and slid them across. Breakfast runs until 9:30. Restaurants on your left, and the elevators just past the fireplace. Thank you. He meant it. He picked up the cards and walked toward the elevator. He had been in his room for 20 minutes when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, businesslike. Owen opened the door. Aldric Fennimore was standing in the hallway in a suit jacket and dress shirt, no tie, a smile that showed all his teeth. Behind him, standing slightly to the left, a security guard. Heavy set, maybe 50, the kind of man who'd been in that uniform so long it felt like a second skin. His name tag said Gord. Mr. Dakers. Fennimore's voice carried the careful warmth of someone who had practiced de-escalation training and retained only the tone. We just wanted to follow up on your check-in, make sure everything was to your satisfaction. Owen looked at him for a moment. His room was fine. He had put down his bag, hung up his coat, and opened his notebook at the small desk by the window. The key cards worked. The heat worked. The television worked. There was no conceivable reason for the general manager to personally follow up on a standard check-in for a single guest in a standard room. Everything's fine, thank you. Fennimore's smile didn't shift. We actually noticed there might be a small discrepancy with the reservation. Our system sometimes flags third-party bookings. Just a formality, but could I ask you to come back down to the desk? We may need to re-verify the card. The card was already verified. It went through at check-in. Right, but our system. Fennimore made a gesture with his hand that was meant to suggest helplessness, but landed closer to dismissal. Sometimes there's a secondary authorization required. Company policy. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes. Owen stood in the doorway. He knew what this was. He had read the 2 prior complaint files word for word. He knew the script. He also knew that nothing he said in this hallway would matter unless it was documented. So he said quietly, I'd like to know the specific nature of the discrepancy. Fennimore's smile tightened. Just procedure, Mr. Dakers, if you'll come with us. That last word, us, with Gord standing there behind him, was not accidental. Owen came, not because he had to, because this was exactly what he had come to see. In the lobby, 2 other guests moved through without being stopped. A couple with matching luggage and a reservation card they were looking at while they walked. Nobody asked to re-verify their card. Nobody approached them with a smile that meant something else underneath. Owen stood at the desk while Fennimore typed very slowly at a terminal. Joelle had moved to the far end of the counter and was keeping her eyes on a screen that Owen could see from where he stood was showing an empty inbox. What name did you book under? Fennimore asked, even though he had Owen's identification in his hand. Owen Dakers. Same as on my ID. And the card? Same card I checked in with. Same card Joelle ran 40 minutes ago. Joelle's shoulders moved slightly. She didn't look up. Fennimore typed. Then he set down the keyboard and looked at Owen over the top of the desk. Here's the thing, Mr. Dakers. We've had some issues lately. Security issues. We've had to be careful about who we extend accommodation to. Owen waited. What sort of security issues? Fennimore spread his hands. It's a small town. We get people passing through. People who aren't from here. Sometimes there are concerns about the character of a guest. He said the word character the way a man says a word he has chosen very carefully because he can't say the word he actually means. We have a responsibility to our regular guests. Is there a complaint about my conduct? Not specifically. Then what, specifically, is the nature of the concern about my character? Fennimore looked at him. The look of a man who had expected the conversation to have already ended one way or another before reaching this point. I'm just going to need you to provide an additional form of identification. I provided government-issued photo ID at check-in. Something more. He paused. Comprehensive. We'd feel more comfortable. Owen looked at the lobby around them. 3 guests in armchairs near the fireplace. A family by the elevator with 2 young children. A man at the restaurant entrance in a high-visibility vest who had just come off a job somewhere. Every one of them white. None of them asked for comprehensive identification. He said calmly, "I'm not going to do that." Fennimore's posture changed. Something that had been held in check for the last 10 minutes shifted forward. He came around the side of the desk slowly. Gord moved with him by 2 steps. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the room, Mr. Dakers. We'll issue a full refund. You're asking me to leave a paid reservation because you're uncomfortable with my presence. I'm asking you to leave because we have concerns about my character." Owen said it for him. "Yes, I heard you." He looked at Fennimore for a long moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Fennimore took a half step back. Gord put a hand on his radio. Owen unhooked the lanyard from around his neck and set the identification card flat on the front desk. His photograph, his name, the Ontario Human Rights Commission seal. Fennimore read it. His face went through several things in quick succession. Confusion, because the card didn't belong to the situation he thought he was managing. Then understanding, because it did, just not in the way he had planned. Then something that started in the jaw and moved through the shoulders. "My name is Owen Dakers," Owen said. "I am a senior field investigator with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. I was assigned to this file based on 2 prior complaints from black guests at this hotel. I did not expect to become a 3rd complaint, but here we are." Nobody in the lobby moved. Joelle looked up from her screen. Her face had gone still in a particular way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with recognition. She had been watching this happen. She had just watched it happen to a man who had a commission ID card under his coat, and she had watched it happen in the same way she suspected it had happened before. To people who did not have a commission ID card, who went home with a refund and no recourse. She picked up the phone behind the desk. Fennimore's hand went up. "Joelle," she dialed. "My name is Joelle Harker. I'm a front desk employee at the Lakemont Grand Hotel in Creighton Falls. I need to report that a guest has been asked to vacate their room by the general manager. The guest has identified himself as an Ontario Human Rights Commission investigator. I witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning of check-in." She held the phone without looking at Fennimore. He stood there. The lobby was very quiet. The gas fireplace made a small, steady sound. The chandelier held its light over everything. Owen picked up the lanyard. He walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, waited, and rode up to the 2nd floor. He sat down at the desk by the window, opened his notebook, and started writing. Everything. The knock on the door, the wording Fennimore had used, the 2 guests he had watched move through the lobby unimpeded. Gord's hand on the radio, the character of a guest. Every word in order in ink. Below his window, the sleet had stopped. The parking lot was wet and orange under the lights. He wrote for 2 hours without stopping. The response was faster than he expected, which told him something about the seriousness with which the regional office had been watching this file. By 7 that evening, 2 investigators from the Commission's regional office in North Bay had arrived at the Lakemont Grand. They were met in the parking lot by an Ontario Provincial Police constable who had driven over from the detachment on the edge of town. Not because a crime had necessarily been committed, though that was still being determined, but because a formal complaint had been received and protocol required a presence. The hotel restaurant cleared out within the hour, not because anyone was asked to leave, just because people could read a room. Joelle gave her statement in the lounge, sitting at a table by herself, speaking to a woman from the regional office who took notes on a laptop and asked questions with the patient precision of someone who had done this before. Joelle had been working at the Lakemont for 11 months. In that time, she had watched Fennimore redirect black guests to different room categories without explanation, request additional documentation that was not standard procedure, and on 2 occasions personally escort guests from the building. She had not filed a complaint. She hadn't known how. Now she was talking, and she did not stop until she had said everything. Gord cooperated immediately. He was a contracted security officer, not an employee of the hotel. He had followed Fennimore's instruction because that was his job. He'd been uncomfortable from the moment they walked down that hallway, and he said so clearly and without hedging. Fennimore took a different approach. He asked for the hotel's legal counsel before he said a word. Counsel arrived by phone. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Then Fennimore sat down across from the investigator from North Bay and explained that he had been acting on standing guidance from the ownership group, protecting the hotel's brand, ensuring the comfort of regular guests. The investigator asked him to identify which specific guests by name he had been directed to monitor. Fennimore opened his mouth, closed it, said he'd need to review company documentation. The investigator noted in the file that no such documentation was produced. Ownership was called that night. The group's head of operations was in Toronto. He drove up the next morning, which said something about how seriously the company understood the situation. He met with the regional investigators for 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, Aldric Fennimore was placed on administrative suspension effective immediately. Gord was released from contract. The hotel was notified that it would be subject to a formal commission investigation with subpoena authority over employment records, guest logs, and internal communications for the prior 24 months. The guest logs were the part that mattered most. What they showed when the investigators ran the numbers was not subtle. Over 14 months of digital records, black guests were asked for supplementary identification at a rate 4 times higher than white guests. Black guests in the standard category were more frequently relocated to ground floor rooms, the least desirable than white guests who booked the same category. 3 guests had been asked to leave during Fennimore's tenure, all 3 black. All 3 issued refunds with a form letter citing unspecified concerns. All 3 had accepted the refund and gone home. One of them was a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher from Sudbury who had booked a room to attend her niece's wedding reception in the hotel's own banquet hall. She had driven 3 hours. She had been told the morning of the wedding that the hotel had overbooked. The banquet records showed the hotel had not overbooked. Fennimore had personally checked her out. She was contacted by the commission in the 3rd week of the investigation. She had been carrying what happened to her for over a year. She had told her niece it must have been a clerical error. She had not wanted to make the wedding about something harder. When the investigator called her, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew. I just didn't know what to do with knowing." Her statement became one of the central documents in the case. 2 more guests came forward within the month, then 3 more. 7 complaints in total, spanning 18 months, all describing the same pattern, the same language, the same mechanism. Different guests, identical bones. The commission's formal decision came down on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after Owen Dacres had walked through the revolving door. The findings were unambiguous. Systemic discrimination on the basis of race, contrary to Section 1 of the Ontario Human Rights Code. The Lakemont Grand Hotel, under the management of Aldric Fennimore, had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory treatment of black guests that was deliberate, documented, and ongoing. Fennimore was named personally in the decision. He had not been acting on company policy. The investigation had found no written guidance from ownership directing his conduct. The standing guidance he had described did not exist. It had been his own judgment, exercised repeatedly over 14 months, producing the same outcome every time. His employment was terminated the day the decision was published. His hospitality management license was referred to the provincial body for review. He would not manage a hotel again. The ownership group signed a remediation agreement with the commission, mandatory human rights training for all staff, including management, every 6 months. A revised check-in policy with no discretionary supplementary ID requirements. An independent third-party review of guest complaints for the following 3 years. Public posting of the commission's findings in the hotel lobby in a frame near the front desk. That last condition had been requested specifically by Joelle Harker, who was still working there, who had asked, through her own brief statement to the commission, that the findings be visible to every person who walked through that door. Not buried in a legal filing, not summarized in a press release. There, Joelle received a formal acknowledgement of her cooperation in the investigation. She put it in her personnel file. She didn't frame it. She went back to the desk and kept doing her job, which she did with the same warmth she brought to it every shift. The retired schoolteacher from Sudbury, her name was Claudine Beaumont, and she deserved to be named, received a written apology from the ownership group, a formal acknowledgement that the treatment she had received was discriminatory, and a financial settlement. She attended her niece's next family event, a birthday party held at a different venue. She did not return to the Lakemont Grand. That was her choice, and she made it without rancor. She had said what needed to be said. She did not need anything else from them. Owen Dacres did not appear in any press coverage. He did not give interviews. He filed his report, testified before the commission panel in the formal adjudication, and returned to his office in Toronto. His colleagues described him the way they had always described him. The man who carried a notebook and listened more than he spoke. The man who had seen the inside of more lobbies, offices, and waiting rooms than anyone in the building, and who had never once raised his voice because he never needed to. His daughter Simone called him the evening the decision was published. She had read the summary online. "Dad," she said, "it's in the news. I know. You're not going to talk about it." No, a pause. Then, "I'm proud of you." He was quiet for a moment. "They didn't treat me any differently than they treat anyone else. That's exactly why," he said good night. He made tea. He sat in his kitchen in Toronto and opened a different file for a different complaint in a different town. There were always more towns. 6 months after the decision, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a broader report on patterns of discrimination in hospitality accommodations across the province. The Lakemont Grand case was not the only one they had investigated. It was, however, the most thoroughly documented, because on the day the pattern began to repeat itself, the person sitting in room 214 had been in a position to write everything down. The report recommended mandatory anti-discrimination training for hospitality staff province-wide. It recommended standardized check-in procedures that removed managerial discretion over which guests received additional scrutiny. It recommended anonymous reporting channels for hotel employees who witnessed discriminatory conduct but feared retaliation. Creighton Falls did not make national headlines. The town kept its traffic light and its Legion Hall and its hardware store. The Lakemont Grand kept its green awnings. But the photograph that used to hang behind the front desk, Fennimore at a ribbon cutting, smiling that practiced smile, was gone. The nail hole was patched. The wall was painted. What Joelle put in its place was not a photograph. It was a laminated copy of the Commission's public notice of findings, required by the remediation agreement, signed, dated, posted where every guest checking in would see it, whether they wanted to or not. On a Thursday in late March, almost 5 months after Owen Dacres had first walked through the revolving door, a woman came in with 2 young children and a reservation and set bag on the counter. Joelle found her booking in 9 seconds, printed her key cards, pointed her toward the elevator. The woman paused on her way past the desk and looked at the frame on the wall. "Read it." Looked at Joelle. Joelle held her gaze. The woman nodded, just once, small, the kind of nod that carries a whole conversation inside it. She went upstairs. Joelle turned back to her screen. Somewhere in this province, on some other Thursday afternoon, a person was walking into a hotel lobby for the first time, waiting to find out which version of the door they were walking through. And somewhere in a rental car in a parking lot, a man with a notebook was already there, watching, listening, writing it all down. So let me ask you something. If you had been standing in that lobby, if you had seen what Joelle saw from behind that desk, 11 months of it, when would you have picked up the phone? Would you have waited until someone else's credentials were lying on the floor? Or would you have called the first time you knew something wasn't right? Leave your honest answer in the comments. Not the easy one. The one that's true. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These things don't change by sitting in one person's head. They change when they move. Subscribe if you're here for stories that don't look away. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Because every time we tell a story like this, we put a little more light into the places people would rather keep dark. And that light adds up.